brothers and sisters of St. Mark's Church, and welcome to 4 weeks of the history of Anglicanism. We have to go back to England, that's where it started. Anglicanism in North America started in 1607 in Jamestown. I'll talk about a little of that later, but today we need to talk about some of the beginnings. So here is some notes ahead of time. You can watch this before Mass, but that will make it kind of long. I wouldn't. If I were there, I'd watch it during the week sometime when I could sit down and take notes and then Google names. If you have questions, please send them in, and you send them in to Shay, and she puts them together and sends it to me. Now, I will tell you, here comes the gossip and fun of this. Something personal about Father Bill, and I will tell you, like a lot of people my age, I have missing teeth. And I have a partial plate in the front for those 4 teeth. Now, since March, when I began to isolate and people buy food for me, and I don't get there myself and get carried away, I've lost 10 pounds, which is a good thing, my doctor says so, but my partial no longer fits. So I'm in kind of a quandary. I went back and found the original temporary from 4 years ago, and I forced it in so you don't have to look at like I'm a refugee from Deliverance film. But what could happen is this. I reach in to tighten them, or I turn around to tighten them. Now, if you're really lucky, like people who go to bullfights and car racing, you're really hoping to see something dramatic and bloody, well, you might. They might pop out and fly across the room and hit the face shield of Ron Burnett, who is sitting 20 feet away. I kind of hope that doesn't happen. We're on a 45-minute limit because there's only so much you can take of talking heads. And Ron has promised to look up as many pictures as he can to go there so as to alleviate some of your boredom on a talking head. Okay, the early church in Britain. I'm going to start out by telling you a legend. It's an important legend in Britain and for Anglicans, but this is a legend. This is not true. And the legend is about the Glastonbury thorn. And the legend goes this way. Joseph of Arimathea, who does indeed show up in the New Testament, remember he's the one that gave his own new tomb for Jesus' body and went to ask Pilate for the body. In the legend, Joseph of Arimathea is a businessman, and he has a metals business, and he needs tin. He is also the uncle of Jesus. Now, here's where some history comes in. Cornwall in Britain was one of the chief places in the ancient world, along with Afghanistan, that had deposits of tin. And why is tin so important? Because if you mix tin, 10% to copper, 90%, you get bronze. And bronze was so important that they named a whole epic of human history about it, the Bronze Age. So, St. Joseph of Arimathea takes the young Jesus to Britain with him, and when he's there, when he arrives on the soil, St. Joseph of Arimathea plants his hawthorn stick walking stick into the soil. It immediately blooms into a lovely tree and becomes the Glastonbury thorn. Okay, not true, lovely, lovely thing. But the reason it sticks on is because in the last century, William Blake, the poet, wrote a poem called Jerusalem. I will quote you a little bit of it. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? It goes on. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, someone wrote music to it. And that music was taken up by a very important women's club called the WI in England, and they sing it before all their meetings. It has become one of those popular songs. They have a thing called Promenade in England, which is a sing-along, okay? And they always sing Jerusalem. So, of course, the wretched Puritans, after the Reformation, cut the tree down as it was idolatrous, but it was planted back from some kind of a shooting. I wanted you to know about that. Now we get into pretty much history. When did Christianity come to Britain? Well, probably in the 2nd century. We have some ancient writers, such as Tertullian and Origen, who said boastfully that there were Christians in Britain at the edge of the Roman world in the 2nd century, and Tertullian and Origen date to about 200 AD, beginning of 3rd century. Could be true, they could just be boasting. We have archaeological proofs that probably would hold there were Christians in the 2nd century. And it's that archaeological stuff that's really kind of interesting, because we have, remember, there could be no churches before 313 AD when Constantine made Christianity legal. So we were outlaws until then. So no churches, but people did have mosaic floors in their houses. And some of them do show Christian symbolism. And one of them even shows a young, non-bearded Christ with a Cairo behind him. We'll hope that Ron can find you a picture of that. All right, so we got some Christians. Who do we first have named? The first named Christian is St. Alban. And his martyrdom is figured about between 250 and 300 AD, when the church was still persecuted. And Alban was a soldier, and his house was sheltering a Christian priest, and the authorities were coming after him, and to save the priest's life, Alban himself donned the priest's clothes and turned himself in, and they killed him. So that was in the Roman city of Verulamium, which is today called, guess what? St. Albans. In the Middle Ages, there was a great shrine to St. Alban. When I pilgrimaged there, they had pieces of the shrine to kind of give you an idea what it looked like. I understand they've actually built it back now. Anyway, so we know St. Alban. And we also get St. Alban mentioned in the Venerable Bede, who wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and to a writer of the Old British Church, the Welsh Church, St. Gildas. And so it's a pretty done deal that St. Alban was the first British martyr. Who do we have coming up after that? Padraig. Now, Padraig is generally known as Patrick, as in St. Patrick. St. Patrick, 389 to 461, was born in the north of England, you know, close to where Ireland comes across. His father was a deacon, his grandfather was a priest. He is captured by Irish pirates and sold into slavery in Ireland. Some years later, having really renewed his Christian faith as a slave, he goes to Gaul, and Gaul was kind of separated from the rest of the church as well, and is ordained there, and goes back to Ireland. Not the first person that tries to Christianize Ireland, but the most successful. And so he Christianizes Ireland. So in 461, Ireland is Christian. But the Irish church is set up rather different than other churches divided into dioceses, because the Irish, my ancestors by the way, are tribal people. And so the church centers grow up around the monasteries, not around the diocese. And bishops are in the monasteries. So it works out for them, and it flourishes in Ireland, and Ireland becomes a center of learning. So let me go back in time again now to Britain. What happens to the church in Britain? Well, in 410 AD, the city of Rome finds itself besieged by the horrid barbarians, and they are calling all their troops back to defend the city. So in 410, the Roman legions just pack up, tell the Britons, well, see to your own defense and good luck, and off they go. And so now the British, including those Christians, are left to look to their own. By this time, remember, after 313, when Constantine wins the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and legalizes Christianity, it's okay. So there's more Christians in England. So what happens after 410 AD? Well, what happens after 410 AD is that they hold on for a while. But the whole infrastructure of Britain left with the Romans. I mean, it wasn't just the soldiers, it was all the infrastructure around the soldiers. And so it didn't prove to be real permanent, and that's kind of a shame. So what happens? In 376, in 476, I've got to stop and think for a minute there. In 476, yes, is the fall of Rome completely. So this was working up to it. Now, So where do they go? Well, what happens is the Saxons, and here is a big historical question, they either invaded or it was simply a great mass of settlement. And historians are very divided on this now. The latest that I have seen and read is there is no evidence of great battles about invasions of Anglo-Saxons. There is evidence of the emptying out of portions of Saxony and Frisia that simply meant it was great to get over there into Britain because it was a better living. So whatever you do there, it was the Saxons that came over and displaced the British. There were probably less British and more Anglo-Saxons, but they did it. So what happened to the British Christians? Well, as they said, go west, young man. And they went west. They fled before the horde of the Anglo-Saxons and ended up in West England and principally in Wales and in Cornwall, where they did have trading partners with the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Empire, and they had a very flourishing Christian church. St. Gildas, who is the one that wrote something, tells us about that old church, and he wrote somewhere at the beginning of the 500s. And about 100 years after when the Romans left, St. Gildas writes, he does not like the Anglo-Saxons at all. The Welsh church never tried to convert the Anglo-Saxons because they'd suffered so much under them. But they had a very literate church. The Latin of the Welsh church is perfect, whereas the Latin of places like Spain and Italy and France was not. There's a reason for that. The people of France and Italy and Spain thought they were speaking Latin, but they no longer were. They were speaking vulgar Latin, which was on its way to becoming Italian, French, Portuguese, and all those things. But it was a foreign language to the what we would now call the Welsh-speaking people, the old British speakers. So there are some wonderful things brought to us spectacularly by the archaeologists and the people that have done work there. So the church was alive and well in Wales and in Cornwall. So we have a Welsh Cornish church going on. And then we have this great missionary outpouring by the Irish. So they had been Christian since Patrick made them Christian by 461. Patrick, incidentally, founded his cathedral and the whole head of the Irish church in Armagh. And Armagh is now in Northern Ireland. There are two competing cathedrals, one on the original site, which is the Anglican one, and one on the other hill opposite, which is the Roman Catholic one, which is kind of a sad thing, but I understand they're friendly now. So that they are organized in their monasteries and they are ready to go do something for the faith. So the first one to head out was St. Columba. St. Columba has a patchy background. He was a hot-blooded young man, and I know the British always said, well, you know the Irish are hot-blooded. Well, you know, so. But he got into a big, he copied a psalter, and that was not supposed to be done. The copies all belonged to the parent thing, and he had one. And believe it or not, it led to a war. And Patrick slew several people. And he repented of that, and in order to have a full penance, he takes a group of monks and he leaves Ireland and he sails across the Irish Sea, and they stop on a Scottish little island called Iona. Now, Iona became a real Christian center in Scotland. It still is today. People pilgrimage there. They've restored some of the stuff. There are both Church of Scotland Presbyterian and Scottish Episcopal places there, as well as Roman Catholic. So it's a big deal. But St. Columba really did a number. He converted whole tribes of people. And the proof of that was, when you think of the Scots' first language, a lot of people say, oh, the old language was Gaelic. Actually, no. The old language was Celtic, more like Welsh. It's the Irish who brought the Gaelic over there. And some people tell me, because I have no Gaelic whatsoever, that in Scotland, some people can still understand their Irish cousins when they speak Gaelic back and forth. But he did a good job, St. Columba did. And he founded lots of churches, and so we have a Welsh church and we have a Celtic church. Now, St. Columba dies in 597. And that was the year that the Pope sent missionaries to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons. The Pope sent Gregory the Great. Now, the old story is that Gregory the Great was visiting the market and saw some slaves for sale. And he had never seen these really blonde, blue-eyed people before, and he thought, well, now, those are pretty people, aren't they? And he asked one of his friends, you know, who are they? And the man said, Angles, in Latin, Angli. And the Pope said, non Angli sed angeli, not angels, but angels. Okay, probably, you know, but on the other hand, it's a nice story. So the Pope decides it's time to send missionaries into England to convert these pagan Anglo-Saxons. So he picks Augustine or Augustine. I was always taught that the one that wrote all the theology in North Africa was Augustine, and the first Archbishop of Canterbury was Augustine, and then some people reversed it, so you just say what you want to. Anyway, Augustine did not want to go. I mean, it was cold and blustery there, and they were pagans, and they could kill him, and I mean, he tried to talk the Pope out of it, and he turned around and wanted to come back, and the Pope wouldn't let him. And so he finally gets there saying, okay, I'll die, you know. Well, he got there, and they went marching in to the small town, which was then a small town. It was the capital town of Canterbury on the south coast of England, singing hymns and with a large silver cross before, and got there and discovered to their utter amazement, they were welcomed in the open air because the pagan king didn't trust the magic of having them inside with all that singing and crosses and stuff. But the king, Ethelbert, someone that wrote music, yeah, Ethelbert, was married to a Christian, Bertha, who came from Gaul. So here they get there and they discover there is already a Christian there with her own chapel and her own bishop and all kinds of stuff. So in they go, having half the work done for them. And so he has really good, I mean, the king finally converted, and when the king converts, practically the whole country does. So, you know, Ethelbert's people converted with him, and it looks like he's having wonderful success, and indeed he was. And somewhere along the line, he discovered there was another kind of Christian in Britain, and that was up in Wales. So he traverses over there and informs them that, you know, he was the primate of England sent by the Pope, and they needed to reverence him and obey him and also accept the authority of the Pope. That was at the Oaks of Mamre, and the Welsh bishops looked at him like he was crazy and said, who's the Pope? Okay. The Pope wasn't that universal figure he kind of is today. They had developed perfectly fine without having to diddle around with the Bishop of Rome, and they wanted to keep on diddling around without the Bishop of Rome. So back they went, and they weren't going to bow down to Augustine at all. So anyway, but he does give him his credit, a great swath of the Anglo-Saxons in the south of England were converted. Now, they decided then that they needed to go to the north of Britain. Now, next week when I rehash this lecture, I'm going to have a map here. And I'll point out these things like, where is Northumbria? Northumbria is north of York, okay? It's way up there. And they sent a mission up there under a man whose name was Paulinus. And the king who he goes to preach to is King Ed1. Okay, up he goes, and remember, Paulinus is a Roman Catholic. So the Anglo-Saxons are pretty well now Roman Catholics. The Welsh are Welsh Catholics, and St. Columba's mission to Scotland is pretty well Celtic Catholics. We got three going, okay? And he has some success, Paulinus does up there, in converting King Edwin's court. And the Venerable Bede, 673 to 735, who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, writes for us what happened on the night that Paulinus is preaching to King Edwin's court. It has become a kind of famous thing that people talk about. St. Bede reports on King Edwin's council about the new religion, Christianity. Inside the castle all is warm for the king and his nobles. Outside a blizzard is raging. A sparrow flies swiftly through the hall. It comes in at one door and quickly flies out through the other. For the time it is inside, the storm and wintry tempest cannot touch it. But after the briefest moment of time, it vanishes from our sight. It flies out of the winter storm, and quickly into it again. So this human life appears for a short time. Of what is to follow and what went before, we are completely ignorant. So if this new doctrine gives us more certain information, it seems right that we should follow it. And they did. A lot of people talk about life and all kinds of things about the sparrow in the wintry night that flies through the wormhole and out the other side of the hole and all of that. Bede could write. Incidentally, Bede was an Anglo-Saxon, but he wrote in Latin. His writing was translated into Anglo-Saxon by King Alfred the Great, and I'll have more to say about that anon. So, what happens though after King Edwin's court converts is that there is a nasty pagan called Penda, and Penda raids, kills Edwin, takes over the whole country. The heirs to the throne flee, as I would too, and they go to Iona. Now remember, Iona is a Celtic Christian center, all right? So Penda has taken over. Paulinus flees with the queen, who is the daughter of Bertha and Ethelberg, and stays down there. The only Christian leader left is James the deacon. It's like everyone fled Glendale, and the only person left was Susie and Samus. I mean, to run the whole thing, you know. So it's a hard thing. So finally, Penda is done in another battle, and Oswald, the successor, comes back from Iona, bringing with him the person he wants to help reconvert Northumbria, and that person's name is Aidan. Big name up there, Aidan. There's a great statue of Aidan in front of St. Mary the Virgin Church on Lindisfarne Island. I pilgrimaged there one time. Hard to get into Lindisfarne. It's one of those tidal islands. You got to get in there just the right time and leave at the right time, or you're submerged. Anyway, Aidan founds a monastery on this island, Lindisfarne, a tidal island, and it becomes a great center of Northumbrian Christianity. And he converts the people, and there are lovely pictures of St. Oswald going around with St. Aidan speaking Gaelic, St. Oswald translating into Anglo-Saxon. I mean, it's some nice stuff. But the Venerable Bede never likes to write anything bad about anyone, so you don't get Oswald's nasty side. There was one, I guess. So the Venerable Bede was in a monastery at Jarrow since he was about 9 years old. He never knew any other life. Very holy man, wrote in Latin those many tomes of the ecclesiastical history of the English people. He is one of the sources of the only stuff we know about the early church in England. But like I say, he only liked to write nice things, and so it's always hard with religious writing to find where the actual, what we would call history today, is in there. But it's a great thing. So we now have Aidan founded that. Aidan was succeeded by Cuthbert, another wonderful Celtic saint. And I remember still yet being so very touched when I made a pilgrimage once to Durham Cathedral in Northumbria, beautiful Norman Gothic cathedral, and discovered that at one end of the cathedral, back where the font was, there's a separate chapel where the Venerable Bede is buried, and his shrine is there. At the other end of the cathedral, behind the altar, is where St. Cuthbert is buried. Now, I've always liked the way that the Church of England marks its saints off. You don't have a bunch of really gaudy things much anymore. What you have are 4 candles at the edges of the tomb and a spray of flowers. And all Cuthbert says is Cuthbertus in Latin. Oh, it touched me greatly. Both of those did. I found several kinds of saints like that. Once in Oxford, I found St. Frida Switho, and I didn't even know who she was, but there it was, you know, all marked up nicely like that. So, at this point, we have, and we're working up towards the 7th century now, we have three churches in Britain, okay? We have the Roman Catholic Church, we have the Celtic Catholic Church, and we have the Old British or Welsh Catholic Church. This is difficult. I mean, it's working up towards the Middle Ages, and there are problems. There are differences. For instance, the Celtic Catholics celebrated Easter on another day. They reckoned it, rightly to their reckonings, to be on one day, and the Roman Catholics did on another. Don't know what the Welsh did. The Irish also tonsured themselves like the old pagan monks had. They've shaved the front of the head back to the middle, whereas the Roman Catholic Church puts the tonsure on the back. And if you look at the back of my head, I think I have a natural tonsure back there, as I have inherited male pattern baldness from my mother's side. So that's what a tonsure looks like. A lot of little stuff, but there was a great holiness to Celtic Catholicism, and it's been revived in the modern church, so that you will see a lot of Episcopalians getting into Celtic spirituality. At any rate, what to do? Now, it comes to a head with things like this. In Northumbria, the king, who is a Celtic Catholic, is celebrating Easter. His wife, who is a Roman Catholic, is at the same time celebrating Palm Sunday and has yet to go through all the fasts of Holy Week. This is upsetting to court life, okay? So when you got a mixed marriage like that, you need to do something. If the kingdom is divided in not doing the whole right thing, so what do? Well, there was a man called St. Wilfrid, not one of my favorites in British church history. St. Wilfrid was kind of an arrogant man, brilliant, full of the faith. He converted many people, but he had made a visit to Rome and became so incessantly and blatantly Roman Catholic that it annoys me. He got himself consecrated bishop in Gaul, in France, and had himself carried in on a golden chair. That kind of did me in right there. People that carried on golden chairs tend not to impress me. So anyway, he was going to make everything as Roman as he could. So they got together and they called a synod of all the Christians, all the Christian bishops in Britain. And that was called the Synod of Whitby. Whitby is kind of down from Durham right there. I'll show you next week. It was one of those monasteries that had both men and women in separate sides of the monastery, of course. And the head of it was the abbess Hilda of Whitby. And so they met there in 664 to try to iron out their difficulties. Now, I think most of them had probably come to their decision ahead of time. They opted, and St. Wilfrid's point was, the Prince of the Apostles was Peter, not John, because the Celtic Church looked to John for the dating of Easter. That never convinced me. I mean, Jesus did say, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I build my church, whose sins you admit they are remitted." But then on Pentecost he breathed on the rest of the apostles and said the same thing. So, okay. At any rate, Wilfrid won, and the church accepted the universal primacy of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. It wasn't received well by everyone. Some of them went off to their own thing, and Coleman was one. I always liked him. He went and founded his own monastery and retired to Ireland, where a lot of people still did the Celtic Church anyway. I don't know what the Welsh people did. I guess they went along with that. And so basically, at that point, after the Synod of Whitby, more or less, but after a century or so, it won, they all became a part of the church in the West, whose primate was the Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope. So there we have that. Now, later on, because the British Church is not real well organized, and they haven't been all put together until Whitby, someone needs to come in and put the infrastructure there to get it to work right. And that man was Theodore of Tarsus. Tarsus was where St. Paul came from, now in modern-day Turkey. And here's the one that gets me as an old guy. He was 68 years old when he went to Britain, and he ministered there for 20 more years. Oh dear, I have to admire that, especially, when I get up in the morning and need 2 cups of coffee to walk. So the man was a force. He was the one that went around, visited all the churches, organized them into the dioceses, made sure there was enough bishops. The infrastructure becomes, just perfectly put together. And so there it is. It looks like a good time is to be had for the church in England Scotland and Wales, to say nothing of Ireland. Okay? No, well, there's always something that comes along, isn't there? And what came along in the latter 8th century, and mostly in the 9th, about 780 to the early 800s, was the Vikings. And the first great horrible slaughter by these nasty, nasty Vikings was in Lindisfarne. They landed on Lindisfarne and slaughtered the monks. I mean, it's a terrible thing. If someone were to make a movie out of it, it'd just turn your stomach and have to be rated X, as they sliced through all the holy monks and cut off their heads and stole all the gold and silver and other things they thought that they could use, and just left Lindisfarne a ruin. That started it. Then they started going all over England, both sides. They had these ships, and the drafts on these ships was not very much, so they're not only seaworthy, they can come in rivers, even little rivers, clean inland and rape and pillage and do all those things that the Vikings did so well. They got to Dublin. A whole portion of Dublin was Viking. And if you visit Dublin, you'll still see all the remnants of that with the Viking things. There's even a ride that you can get on. And they'll give you a horned hat to wear, which the Vikings never did, and a free glass of beer. And they'll put you on that and sing, pumping beer all the time. They wheel around Dublin. I've seen them drinking and shouting Viking whatevers, I don't know. I felt rather bad about that till I understand it was one of the ways that Christ Church Cathedral funded their budgets. So there we are. So the Vikings got around. And they invaded, and then they invaded to stay. So you've got whole sections of Vikings now that are just not there to rape, pillage, and plunder, but they want to make farms as well. So they do. So they become, they take over whole sections of the old British kingdoms until it got down. There's only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom left, and that was Wessex. And the king of Wessex was King Alfred the Great. The only king of England that ever had the Great added to his name. And if you're British, you know the story about he was fleeing from the Vikings and gathering an army, and he comes to a farmhouse, and the housewife lets him in, and she's grilling oat cakes, like pancakes or whatever, over an open fire, and she says, "I've got to go outside and get the eggs from the chickens. Don't let the cakes burn." And sure enough, Alfred gets so worried about the Vikings and the whole thing, when she comes back, she screams at him, "You let the cakes burn," So all English children know that. Probably not true, but when you have a talking head video, you need all the laughs you can get. All right. King Alfred the Great made peace with the Vikings. And England was divided up and between the Vikings, and they were Danish. They were called Danes. The Danes got about half the country. And then Welsh is all aside by itself, and Cornwall's by itself, but the rest became the Kingdom of Wessex, became a center of learning. Alfred wanted people to be educated. He was a great king. He himself translated, the devotional literature and the Venerable Bede and all of that into Anglo-Saxon, had a school and a seminary. King Alfred is well remembered as the Great. So, the Vikings, for many hundreds of years, were settled in the north. Well, take it clean down to East Anglia and around, and when I get the map here next week, I'll show you. Half of England is Danish, speaking Danish and Anglo-Saxon. We don't realize it, but a great deal of the English language, we're a bastard language. We have little pieces all over, mostly from Norman French, of course, but in our pronouns, we picked up the stuff from Danish, from the Vikings, because they were there for hundreds of years. And any word we have in English that begins with an SK, like skill, or scone, or I can't think of any more right now. Scatter, all that. Those are Danish words, okay? So, after a while, because there's trade back and forth between the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes become Christians. It takes a while. I mean, for a while, half the Danes are worshiping Christ and half the Danes are still worshiping Odin, but Jesus wins out in the end. Now, St. Dunstan, 925 to 988, about 25 years after the death of Alfred, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. He really comes down hard on having the rule of Benedict obeyed in the monasteries. Monasteries get lax sometimes, okay? It's what happened when Henry VIII abolished them, suppressed the monasteries. About half of them are really a mess, and I can understand why it happened. The other half are pretty good, so I hold that against Henry. But anyway, St. Dunstan really tightened things up. The one thing I was never with Dunstan on, he was all for clerical celibacy. And we'll have more to say about that anon. So, in 988, remember the Vikings had become Christians. The Danes invade again, and now they won everything, but they're Christians, okay? And the king of all England is Canute. You've probably heard of Canute before, okay? K-N-U-T, spelled in English C-A-N-U-T-E. He becomes the king of England and Denmark, but the Danes are now converted. After Canute's death, his sons are just not worthy. As sometimes happens in history, the sons don't get all the talents of the father, and so there that is. So after his sons are displaced, the Danish Viking usurpers, St. Edward the Confessor becomes king, and the Saxon line is restored in England. Now, a few words about Edward the Confessor. If you've ever gone to Westminster Abbey, and you go behind the high altar, there is a shrine there to St. Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor built Westminster Abbey. And I remember being there, and the guides were saying, shh, shh, this is the holy place, and the Germans all kept talking anyway. But, you know, Edward the Confessor was a very pious man, not a very good king, I think. Well, it was strange. Edward married, but since Edward had taken a vow of virginity, the marriage was never consummated. Now that's a strange thing to me. Must have been even stranger to his wife, come to think of it, but there it was. So Edward, who didn't speak a word of Anglo-Saxon, he was raised in France, in the court of the Duchy of Normandy. Well, he goes over to England, and like I say, he doesn't speak a word of Anglo-Saxon. But before his death, he bequeaths the throne to the Saxon Herald. Now, here's a problem. Edward had previously named his successor William of Normandy, commonly called William the Bastard, who history would later call William the Conqueror. But then he turns around, changes his mind, and bequeaths it to Harold. So there's a problem. Now, it further is complicated by when William points out that in his presence and that of his court, Harold had sworn away all want to be the King of England on holy relics. And this was noted and seen and witnessed, that he bequeathed the throne to William. Well, there it is. Never swear on holy relics and then change your mind. Poor Harold is up north outside of York, fighting yet another battle with the Vikings. When someone reaches him, he bested the Vikings up there, that William and the Normans were invading in the south. So he rushes down again, weary, and they're doing one of those army two-step things, you know, to get down there. He's exhausted, his army is exhausted. They meet Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. A Norman archer gets lucky. The arrow goes into Harold's eye and kills him. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen pictures of the tapestry of Bayeux, which shows that whole invasion thing, including the arrow in Harold's eye, and I'm sure Ron will find a picture of that put on here, so you'll have something other than the talking head. And suddenly everything changes in England. The whole infrastructure changes. The whole elite changes. The whole leadership changes. It now goes from Anglo-Saxon to Norman French. Okay, so William is now the king, and he just gets all the Anglo-Saxon nobility gone. You don't amount to anything anymore. All the Anglo-Saxon bishops gone. You don't have anymore, with one exception. He kept one. And so we now have the French, the Normans, and the Normans, incidentally, Norman comes from Northman. They're Vikings too, but early on, the King of France bought them off by giving them land, and they settled down. One of the difficulties when you try to trace your lineage out of Britain with DNA, and I've done so, and I am a Celt, I'm happy to say, in my male line at least, but you've got the Anglo-Saxons who are Germanic, the Normans who are Vikings and Germanic, and the Vikings who are Northerns and Germanic. So their X chromosome comes out about the same. It's very interesting. I'm sure you didn't want to hear that, but there it is. So now you've got all these people displaced and all the Normans in charge, and William's people go around making these little castles called Motte and Bailey castles so they can defend it and usurped all the land. Everything changes. So they are in charge of all of this. So now the Normans feel themselves sophisticated. The church suffers because it was rather, the Anglo-Saxon church was a homely kind of Catholicism, whereas the Normans were a legalized form of Catholicism and a structured, maybe over-structured kind of legalistic kind of Catholicism. But the Normans saw the Anglo-Saxons as uncouth, unsophisticated, kind of rednecks. And this shows up in one of the most interesting things that happens to language. We are one of the few languages, maybe the only language in the world, that has a dual set of names for the animal on the hoof, where the Anglo-Saxons took care of it, sheared it, gutted it, butchered it, and the same animal on a plate, where the Normans ate it. So, you have ox in Anglo-Saxon. You have beef when it's on the plate, French bœuf. You have sheep on the hoof, and on the plate when the Normans ate it, you have mutton, French mouton. You have hens and chickens out on the hoof, but when you get it on the Norman plate, it's poultry, poulet, okay? And then pigs, which are swine. The old word is swine. You have swine when the Anglo-Saxons took care of it and prepared it, but you have pork when it's on the Norman plate. I mean, in Spanish, we just got one word. It's puerco if it's out there running around getting dirty, and it's puerco when it's a chop on your plate. I mean, that's it. But this kind of stuff happened. You had dual words happen, and the English language is a strange language. We have a lot of shades of meaning in English because we have one word from the Anglo-Saxon and another word from the French. Try to tell yourself what is the semantic difference between kingly, royal, and regal. All right. Now, so Lanfranc becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. He introduced order and discipline on the continental model. He and William were very loyal to the Pope, but not subservient. Okay. So when William dies, he is succeeded to the throne by William II, who was a tyrant and another one that just didn't live up to his father's promise. And the Pope appoints St. Anselm Archbishop. Anselm was a great Archbishop of Canterbury, an Italian guy who wrote all kinds of things like Why God Man, Cur Deus Homo. He wrote the ontological proof for the existence of God, which is still studied in Episcopal seminaries. So anyway, Anselm took the symbols of his office from the Pope, but possession of his lands, churches, and monasteries from the king. And that shows you the big power struggle of the Middle Ages called the investiture controversy. Who gets to appoint the bishop? Who gets to control his lands? Now, the division of church and state in the Middle Ages and up to that was non-existent. The state and the church were one. So this investiture thing becomes a real problem. And I will get into that the next time. But since I have promised 45 minutes, and by the clock on the wall, it is 45 minutes, I'll see you next week. Peace.